Hi everyone, my name is Maarten Hart and this is the third presentation about the Genesis flood. There are many scientific models available that say something about the Genesis flood. Let's take a look at them to see if we can figure out what had happened. In 2010 an extensive report was published called the Flood Science Review. This review was initiated by Joseph Bartwell and involved 6 modelers of the most well-known flood models and 10 panelists who reviewed these models. The result is 1600 pages packed with information. I know some of these people personally, most of them via email, but I had some of them on the phone. I've met both Dr. John Baumgartner and Michael Oort once. I also include some other models and modelers in this presentation that are less well known, but who do have something interesting to say about the Genesis flood. This includes myself, and I don't have an image available of Mike Fisher. But there are many more flood scientists out there not included in this presentation. What I'm going to do is summarize information from the models and label this information into a level of likeliness ranging from true, a certainty, to false, certainly wrong. Note that everything between likely and unlikely can be somewhat subjective. It is always possible that something that is unlikely can be true, but it helps prioritizing what to investigate. Plausible simply means that something is possible, but we cannot determine if it really happened. After that, I will try to combine the information of these models. For this we need to know if the information is compatible, and it could be that one model is the cause of another model. I also see that there is a lot of competition going on between these scientists. I think it is important to kill competition and substitute it for cooperation. So first I'll summarize each model, getting a general idea of the main model, point out some interesting details and then move on to the conclusions. I'll filter out the real evidence. Evidence are things that are real objects such as specific rock, but also scripture is evidence. Even though there is a lot of debate on how it came to be, it's undeniably there, and measurements are evidence. I also look at the applied physical laws as they have consequences, such as if A happened then B must also have happened. Some of the models apply natural laws in simulations. Then I'll take a look at the interpretation of the evidence. For example, if we find a layer of sand, which is the evidence, the interpretation could be that it was transported there by air or by water. But also the interpretation of scripture. For example, there is a sentence in the Bible about a guy named Peleg, which says, "In his days the earth was divided." Some say this refers to the Babel crisis, so it were people of the earth that split it up. Others say, no, it were continents that split in those days. So evidence does not automatically lead to conclusions. You need interpretations, and there can often be alternative explanations. I'll also look at uncertainty bandwidth. Very often we don't need exact numbers. We can just see if a number falls within a valid range. This also applies for scripture. We often do not know for sure what it means, but we can exclude things that it cannot mean. In the end, it's all about explaining this nice blue ball. Here we can see some examples of evidence, things we can find, and this shows some interpretation of that evidence. There are different scales in which we can see evidence. Evidence can be macroscopic, mesoscopic, and microscopic. Mesoscopic can be seen with the naked eye. Microscopic is too small to see with the naked eye, so we need devices to see it. Macroscopic is too large to see it without devices. Just a side note, whenever I talk about mid-oceanic ridges, that is a very large ridge of 70,000 kilometers long in total, stretching all around the globe in the middle of the ocean. You can see them here on this map clearly. There are quite a lot of flood models available. I can't go into much detail, but at the end of this presentation you'll get a general idea about all of these. First is the bathtub model. This model is usually believed by the layman. It is based on a simplistic reading of the Bible. Basically it says water came from somewhere, rainfall, and then Mount Everest got flooded, and then in the end the water went somewhere. So mountains, rain, flood, and back to mountains. This is also the most criticized model. It's basically a straw man. Not any creation scientist believes this. Regular scientists and laymen are often unaware of the existence of water models. The main critics are that it provides no answers to the most direct questions, such as where did the water come from, where did the water go, and where is the evidence? The error is that people are searching for the Genesis flood on top of evolutionary layers. But there is one thing regular scientists and creation scientists agree with. Evolution and the global flood don't go together. Next, it's the Hydroplate Theory. This model is developed by Walt Brown. His main approach is that he invented a flood mechanism based on Bible texts, such as Genesis 7 verse 11. Noah was 600 years old when the water on the earth started gushing out everywhere. His main idea is that water was trapped underneath the earth's crust that broke out and caused gigantic water eruptions. Large pieces of earth crust got shot into space, causing impacts on the moon, and this was even the origin of the asteroid belt. He also believes the continents moved during the flood, floating on top of water, and he believed that the oceanic crust buckled up, causing the mid-oceanic ridges. This is how he illustrates it. Water trapped below the crust caused a fountain and extreme rainfall. Continents started to drift and the mid-Atlantic ridge buckled up. And this is how the buckling works. So you start with a situation of tension and a heavy material on top holding this in place. Then there is a drift. And eventually there is a buckle, because the heavy load isn't there anymore to keep the material in place. So this is how he said the oceanic ridge is formed. He also focuses on some interesting details, such as he claims that if subduction happens, the Earth starts to spin faster. Subduction is a geophysical process where heavy material sinks down into the Earth. I'll get back to that in more detail later. But basically he says when something is spinning, it will spin faster when more mass is going towards the center of the spinning object. This is how skaters make very fast pirouettes, but this also applies to Earth. The crossover depth. Walt Brown refers to almost 20 studies that show that the rock at very large depth can behave very differently than we expect. We know that magma inside the Earth comes out of volcanoes because of density differences. Molten magma is less dense than solid rock, so it rises and comes out. However, magma is also more compressible than solid rock, so there is a point inside the Earth where molten magma is just as dense as solid rock. Below this point, magma even sinks. This point is called the crossover depth. Last detail I'll show is this quartzite block. This is located in the Grand Canyon. As you can see, it's rather large, but it is also a bit misplaced. The quartzite block is made of the same material in the quartzite layer, which you can see here. It is slightly below this block. How did the block get out of the layer and a few meters higher up, inside the layer that is on top of it? This seems to be impossible in a slow deposition of the layers. So Walt Brown interprets this as a violent geological event. So he sees this as evidence the layers did not get there slowly but during the Genesis flood. Here are my conclusions about the Hydroplate theory. The trapped water seems unlikely. There is a lack of evidence. Continents drifting on water seems false, as they are not flat at the bottom. Crust shot into space, and this is plausible, as in theoretically possible, under the circumstances described by Walt Brown. This crust causing impacts on the moon. This appears to be false. There are very much craters on the moon, but the moon covers only a very small portion of our sky. So it is impossible that all craters come from Earth's crust shot into space. Causing the asteroid belt, it seems false, as the volume of it is too large. The buckling of the oceanic crust seems false. The plates deform plastically, like clay, not elastically, like the spring. Earth spinning faster, this is true, in the sense that if subduction happens, the Earth will spin slightly faster. The crossover depth is a true property of the Earth's rock, as confirmed by many experiments. The quartzite block is true, it's there and it demands an explanation. Walt Brown's interpretation of Bible verses. His interpretation fits the uncertainty bandwidth, but it is not the only possible interpretation. Next is the Catastrophic Plate Tectonics theory, developed by John Baumgartner. His approach is to keep most regular interpretations intact, but speed it up into one cataclysm. His main idea is that the continents moved with about 1 meter per second, causing the Genesis flood. The process that allows this to happen is power law creep. He also shows pieces of evidence, such as continents fit like a jigsaw puzzle, magnetic stripes on the oceanic floor, geological layers that are the same on both sides of the Atlantic, and continents are still moving. This is an animation of the sequence of the general idea of continental movement. Scientists believe there used to be a supercontinent called Rodinia, and it moved in pieces into a new supercontinent called Pangaea. Then that split up and drifted into the configuration we know today. The process that causes this is called subduction. Basically, something heavy sinks into the earth and it drags the surface like a tablecloth. John Baumgartner made one of the most advanced geophysical simulators available. He simulated the continental drift, and it appears theoretically possible that the continents drifted from Pangaea into today's configuration in only 30 days. You would need very extreme initial conditions, however. The physics behind this that allowed continents to move that fast is called power law creep. Power law creep is a phenomenon for which you need extreme pressure, which is present deep inside the earth, and then pulled very hard horizontally. When you do that, the rock becomes very weak and as viscous as water. That allows continents to move without much friction and without much rise in temperature, and it's a strong non-linear process. He backs his idea that continents did move by stripes on the oceanic floor, stripes that show magnetic reversals, which indicate the Earth's magnetic field flipped many times during the continental drift. He also shows that geological layers on both sides of the Atlantic are the same. And here is an image from NASA, which illustrates movement of the ocean across today. Today it moves with a few centimeters per year. Conclusions. Continents moving that fast is plausible under the right circumstances. Power law creep is true and tested in laboratory experiments. Continents do fit like a jigsaw puzzle, especially Africa and South America. But there are other configurations possible than Pangaea. Magnetic stripes are partially true. The reversals exist, but the pattern is wrong, and I'll get back to that later. Similar geologic layers on both sides of the Atlantic. Partially true. They are there, but far inland. Continents moving today. True, but the direction is a bit off. Now the impact model. The modeler is Michael Oort. His approach is to look at the evidence and move step by step from there. He looks at craters on Mars and Moon and calculated how many impacts there should be on Earth. After all bodies in the solar systems are cratered, so the Earth could not have been missed. He gets to 36,000 craters larger than 30 kilometers in diameter. Over 100 of them should be larger than 1,000 kilometers. He also says continental basins could be craters. I'll get back to that. But he also admits that this model has a problem. The Ark would be destroyed as well. This is a height map of Mars and a photo of the Moon. Just look at that many craters. A height map of the Moon also clearly shows craters. There are certainly craters on Earth. Almost 200 have been found and confirmed. But that is not nearly as much as there should be based on calculations. One of the largest confirmed craters is the Vredefort crater in South Africa with a diameter of about 300 kilometers. This is a height map of the Earth. You can clearly see the ocean floor is a lot lower than the oceanic crust. We can also take a look below the sediments. This is what the Earth would look like without sediments. What we see then is the rock foundation of the Earth, and now a lot of holes appear. These holes are called continental basins. There aren't any sound explanations from regular scientists for these. Michael Oort says these could be large craters. This is a map of the sediments. So the sediments are mostly inside continental basins and on the edge of the continental plain. According to Oort, all these sediments flushed on the continents during the flood, and part of it eroded when the waters flowed off the continents on what is now the oceanic floor, depositing the sediments on the edge of the continents on its way back. The conclusions. Well, it's true that we find many craters on Earth, and also that the impact chance on Earth is 19 times larger than on the Moon. It's also statistically true that there should be 36,000 craters on Earth, and also that there should be 100 of them larger than 1,000 kilometers in diameter. Continental basins could indeed be craters. Though I say this is plausible, I have seen little other plausible explanations yet. About the problem that the Ark would be destroyed, I would say that is plausible as well. However, I would also say it depends on where the impacts happened. I'll get back to that later. Vertical tectonics. This is also a model from Michael Oort. Though it's fully compatible with the impact model, it can be used and examined without the impact model. Basically, Michael Oort says that the oceanic crust and the continental plate moved up and down, causing a water flow. He says that during the flood, oceanic crust was higher and continental crust was lower. Also, mountains rose during the flood, according to this model. He also points to many surface features, such as faults in sediments, water gaps and massive erosion. Michael Oort also has the beds hypothesis, which stands for briefly exposed diluvial sediments. Also, Michael Oort strongly opposes any idea of continents moving horizontally. About faults, we do find these in many places on Earth. Places where we observe vertical movement of plates relative to adjacent plates. This can be up to 15 kilometers, really huge. Water gaps. That are gaps through mountains that are clearly carved by water. The weird thing, however, is that it is clear the water could have flown much more easily around the mountains than over it or through it. So in order to explain this by slow process over long time spanning, the water must have flown uphill, which is impossible. Michael Oort says, however, the water gaps formed by a sheet of water and a very high water level, causing erosion. Then, when the water level went down, part of it flew through the slight gaps, causing more erosion there, and eventually we have the situation we find today. But this requires a fast water flow and an extremely high water level, which is basically a global flood. Also, many geologists are focusing on the Grand Canyon. However, when we zoom out a little more, we see that the Grand Canyon is a relatively small feature in a much larger feature called the Grand Staircase. The Grand Canyon shows a lot of erosion, but the Grand Staircase shows a lot more erosion. There are more places on Earth where we find these huge areas of missing layers. Evidence for massive erosion, sometimes more than 4 kilometers of sediments are missing. Michael Oort explains this by a huge sheet flow over the sediments. On places where there was a slight uplift, water flowed faster than on places where there was no uplift. Stronger flow means more erosion. More erosion means less material and less weight, thus causing more uplift. So these erosion patterns can best be explained in a huge flood event. Briefly exposed diluvial sediments are a hypothesis to explain the many dinosaur fossils we find inside sediments. He says that large dinosaurs survived the first flows during the rising flows of the flood. They have been walking around on fresh sediments, laying eggs in the few days that they could. This sounds weird, but keep in mind that if this phase took days, pregnant dinosaurs could not hold in the eggs for that long. When they had to lay eggs, they had to lay eggs, even during these crazy conditions. So this rising phase went in pulses, according to Michael Oort. Up a lot, down a little, up a lot, down a little, etc. The evidence he shows is that many dinosaurs are buried in the death pose. They are found with a bent neck in muddy conditions. It's clear evidence that they drowned. And the fact that they are preserved means they have been buried very quickly. Dinosaur fossils are clear evidence for a huge flood. I'm going to be short about Michael Oort's arguments about his ideas that the continents did not move. I personally believe his model is compatible with horizontal tectonics, so I see no reason for opposing it as much as he does. But here are some arguments. He says there are faults in some of the slabs that are supposed to be subducting. This means that they would be torn apart instead of sinking down and pulling the rest like a tablecloth. He also says that the bottom of the continents is so much irregularly shaped that it would block movement. The irregular shapes are called continental roots. He also says that there is no evidence for magnetic reversals. And he also says that the sediments on the oceanic crust are misplaced in case continental movement did indeed happen. To explain this in detail is very time consuming and technical and beyond the scope of this video, so I'm going to skip that for now, and I'll show what my conclusions are for this model. Plates moving up and down during the flood, the evidence surely seems to show that. Oceanic crust higher, continental crust lower also. Mountains rose during the flood seems also very likely. Water gaps, yes, that likely formed during the flood, and this is one of the best arguments against the standard millions of years interpretation. Faults up to 15 kilometers is true, you can go there and see for yourself. About the beds hypothesis, I would say this is plausible and so it can be an explanation in a flood scenario. But this is not the only possible explanations for the evidence of dinosaur fossils. Massive erosion during the flood regression stage, I would say that is very likely. Then his arguments against plate tectonic. Would subducting slabs break instead of sink as a whole? That may be. Continental rocks blocking the movement, I would say it is unlikely. The continental roots could have formed during the movement, and the layers that allows the continental movement because of power law creep is the asthenosphere. This is a layer about 200 kilometers deep. The continental roots reach to about 80 kilometers deep. So the weak layer is below the continental roots. So it seems unlikely continental roots is an argument against plate tectonics. No magnetic reversals, that's false. There is evidence for magnetic reversals. It does not necessarily support plate tectonics though, and I will get back to this. Sediments misplaced in the oceanic floor. Actually, this argument is true. However, this is an argument against specific versions of plate tectonics. There are alternative scenarios possible that fits the evidence. The collapse tectonics model, developed by Philip Budd, with the purpose of providing a defensible biblical alternative to secular geology. I must first say that my knowledge about this model is limited. If you want to know more, read the book Earth in Cataclysm. The main points are: water was trapped in a vuggy crust, which means that water was trapped in tiny spherical holes in a rock called vugs. Precambrian layers are high power flood layers. Everything got pulverized. Paleozoic, Mesozoic and Cenozoic layers are all post-flood, and the reworking of the flood layers in the centuries after the flood. Continents have subsided. Collapse of continental interior, which released water. Mud volcanoes. If you don't know about geology, you probably don't know what all these names like Precambrian mean. All layers have a geological name, and the Precambrian layers are at the bottom, over here. So according to Philip Budd, this is where the Genesis flood layers are, and all the rest are from after the flood. Continental subsidence means that parts of the continental plates have tilted, like over here. Overall, the collapse tectonics model is quite hard to follow and it doesn't seem comprehensive. I'll go to my conclusions quickly. About the goal, finding a defensible arguments, personally I don't consider that a valid goal. I simply want to know the truth. If there is something we don't know, in the sense that there are multiple options, then we don't know. In that case, we should never choose one of the options as being defensible. Water trapped in a vuggy crust. That is theoretically possible. Precambrian layers as high power flood layers. I consider that plausible explanations for these layers. Everything got pulverized. That is also theoretically possible. All those layers on top of the Precambrian are post-flood. I consider this highly unlikely. It would mean that a worldwide catastrophe laid down 20% of the sediments and local much smaller events laid down 80% of the remaining sediments in neat layers, some of which stretching all across continents. It doesn't make sense to me. Continental subsidence. I would say that is true in the sense that we have evidence that this happened in at least some locations. Release of water in mud volcanoes. Although some mud volcanoes exist in the world, it does not seem to be a plausible theory to explain all the sediments Phil Budd considers flood layers. The position of the sediments do not make sense in that case. Shock dynamic theory. The shock dynamics theory is a small model from an amateur, Mike Fisher. He noticed some macroscopic features and tries to explain it in one event. His main idea is that one impact happened on a supercontinent that broke into pieces and moved away from that impact point. For the moving, he considers the impact as a pushing force. One thing he points to is that rock does not break slowly. You need a powerful blow to break it, and continents are made of rock. The impact he points to is either the unconfirmed Shiva craters or something very close to it. Also, Mike Fisher's evidence shows where both Mike Oord and John Baumgartner are wrong. The magnetic stripes on the oceanic floor exist, meaning the magnetic field has switched in the past. However, the stripes are not neat. They are blotchy, which is not possible in a scenario of millions of years of slow spreading. It also doesn't seem to match the catastrophic plate tectonics model. My conclusions: I think he is wrong about one large impact. Michael Oort's evidence is strong that there were many impacts. Impacts breaking the crust into continents, I think this is likely as rock does not break slowly. Continents moving away from the largest impact points. I think that is plausible, although that would be more or less a coincidence. Impacts as a pushing force. That seems false. Imagine you have a rock that is embedded in clay. Take a gun and shoot the rock into pieces. The rock will break, but it will not move. In order to push a rock through clay, you need a very long-lasting force, not a single blow. And the same applies for continents here. Shiva crater, 2 half craters that are found, I think it is likely. Magnetic stripes exist, that is true, but their shape seems to refute spreading ridge theory. The salt eruption model. It is a small model developed by Stef Herema, and it focuses on the large salt layers that we find on Earth. Stef thinks he found an error in the standard theory about how salt diapirs form, and he figured that an alternative explanation of flood works better. His main points: pure salt layers have diapirs of several kilometers high. The salt has been in a molten state. There had been a water flow on top of it. A crust formed on top of the salt. That crust shrunk and ruptured. Hot salt came out, starting water to boil, causing a steam column, and that caused the salt diapir. This is a map of the Netherlands, and the red area shows where the salt layer is. The darker red areas show the salt diapirs. And this is a cross section showing salt diapirs of many kilometers high, buried underneath sediments. This illustrates his model. A rupture in a fresh crust on top of molten salt caused water to boil. Boiling water has lower density, so the salt goes up there. This caused the salt to be pulled out while solidifying. I'll keep it short. I think he is right that the standard theory does not work. The standard theory says that the salt came up in a solid state, because the sediments on top are heavier than the sediments. That does not appear to be true. So an alternative explanation seems to be required, and I think Steffes' model is mostly likely or plausible. The recolonization model, developed by Hans Hogerduin and Jan Rijn de Wit. Their approach is to search the flood, but take standard geological interpretation seriously where possible. They say the flood can be found in the Paleozoic layers only. They consider that high-power flood layers. They present over 40 arguments why they think Mesozoic and Cenozoic layers are not flood. I'll focus on 3 of these as an example. Red beds rusted in air. Ventifacts formed by wind. Dinosaur nests were not made during the flood. They also say the earth has been full of disasters for 300 years after the flood. Continents moved during the flood, Rodinia to Pangaea. Continents also moved after the flood, Pangaea to now, during the so-called Peleg event, based on a Bible verse that says, "In his days the earth was divided." Red beds are made of a red type of rock. The red color is because of rust. Because of this, geologists say that this was deposited by air, as in it rusted in air. However, rusting in water also works, and even goes a lot faster in some conditions. Ventifacts are rocks that are supposedly eroded by air. However, water is able to shape rocks as well. Dinosaur nests are laid upon dry land. They cannot be made underwater. That is true. However, it does not necessarily mean the flood could not have been going on during the time these nests were made, like Michael Oort showed with his beds hypothesis. My conclusions. Paleozoic layers are turbidites. I think that is likely. This is basically what Walt Brown also showed with the big block of rocks in the Grand Canyon. Mesozoic to Cenozoic layers are not flood layers because of many reasons. Even though this doesn't fit what I think has happened, on itself the evidence they provide is not bad. On itself all these arguments are plausible, I have to be honest. But for all of the pieces of evidence they provide counts that an alternative explanation is possible. Moreover, the red beds they show are also in Devonian layers, which are Paleozoic. So on one hand they say red beds are post-flood, but on the other hand what they say are flood layers also contain red beds. Continents moved during the flood from the Rodinia configuration to Pangaea. I think this is very unlikely. The evidence for Pangaea is quite good. The evidence for Rodinia is very weak and it does not match a flood. This is a long story and reaches beyond the scope of this video. Continents moved after the flood from the Pangaea configuration to today's configuration I think is very unlikely, simply because Peleg did not have an arc. Next, the canopy theories, solid and vapor canopy, defended by Dr. Larry Vardiman and Dr. Carl Bath during the Flood Science Review. These are very small models, popular by creation believers but not widely accepted by creation scientists. The models are based on 2 Bible verses. During creation, God said, "I command a dome or canopy to separate the water above it from the waters below it." And during the flood, the sky opened like windows and rain poured down for 40 days and nights. One model says there used to be a canopy of water vapor around the earth. The other model says this was a crystalline canopy with water on top of it, and when the windows of heaven opened, it collapsed. Let's keep it short. The vapor canopy is technically impossible. It cannot hold that much water. The solid canopy theory is very theoretically possible, but the conditions are near impossible. Also, there is lack of evidence in the sense that we don't find any remnants of such a canopy. What about these Bible verses? Well, basically this is one translation and one interpretation, but there are others possible. For example, about the verse that is translated as "the windows of heavens opened up," According to Michael Oort, it can refer to meteorites falling from the sky if you read the original Hebrew version. No flood. This is believed by almost any non-creation scientist that works in related fields. The main approach is to start with the idea the present is the key to the past. According to these scientists, the worldwide flood is a myth that never happened. Main issues are that the formation of geologic features took billions of years. There were Wilson cycles that caused plate tectonics. Mid-oceanic ridges are spreading ridges. There was not one mass extinction, but there were many. And evolution. There's plenty of information available about this model, so I'm going to my conclusions right away. The present is the key to the past is false. Many geological layers we find do not form today. Billions of years is mostly radiometric dating technology. This is a different subject beyond the scope of this video. Wilson cycles seem unlikely. It is very hard to start subduction. To reverse it is even harder, and that is required for Wilson cycles to work. Spreading ridges. This is false. It is believed that magma below ridges come from the Earth's core. But it cannot because of the crossover depth. See my video about heat and the flood. Seismic data also shows that this magma below oceanic ridges is very shallow compared to what is necessary for Wilson cycles to work. It is believed spreading ridges are stationary and continents are moving away from them. However, Africa is almost entirely surrounded by these ridges. So which way is Africa supposed to move? Multiple mass extinctions are on itself plausible. Evolution, this is a different subject and I have more than 20 videos available about it on my YouTube channel. Local flood. There are different versions of this flood theory, but they all say that a local flood was the source of inspiration of the flood myth. Thus, the flood happened, but was not worldwide. I'm taking out one popular example, which is the Black Sea theory. They say it was their entire known world that flooded. They had to evacuate, so they took their pets with them. The evidence is an ancient shoreline and a flooded civilization. And it's only about the moral of the story. People are bad, so God punished them. So how about this flooded civilization? Well, there is an ancient shoreline, but the so-called civilization is just one tiny village. The scientists hope to find more, but so far no luck. Side note, ancient shorelines are extremely rare, more rare than one would expect in a billions of years scenario. Now just read the Bible story. I expect that people will come up with local flood theories. Never did. Because if you do, you find out that it does not match the local flood ideas at all. My conclusions. The Black Sea got flooded is true and was probably a post-flood event. This counts for many other local flood theories I've seen. Ancient shorelines and flooded civilizations. Shoreline, yes. Civilization, no. It was a village. Their entire known world got flooded. This is false. Noah could have walked away in days. This was a source of inspiration for the story of the Bible. This is false. It is not remotely like the story of the Bible. It's about moral only. Also false. The biblical story about the flood contains mostly technical details. Last is the heat model. It's my own model. The idea is to find the best out of all models, merge it into a larger model and investigate the remaining mysteries. I figured that all models have one thing in common. There is too much heat involved. Most of the heat is still inside the Earth, and there are three types of heat transport: flow, radiation and conduction. Impact craters converted into heat sinks and hotspots. Heat sinks were the cause of continental movement. The oceanic crust was molten during the flood. Mid-oceanic ridges are a closing seam. In short, the crust broke open, this exposed the hot mantle, the cold continents got flooded, heat radiated in the sky away to the universe. Water flowed off the continents, enhancing the solidification of the lava, pushing the molten area into closure, leaving mid-oceanic ridges as a closing midpoint, with two plates leaning on each other. All models have one thing in common: too much heat. This is true. Most heat is still inside the Earth, seems very likely. 3 types of heat transport is true. And for the rest, you might expect I'm going to say my model is true. However, I'm not going to say that because I simply cannot know for sure. I'll rate it plausible. So let's decide which model is best. We can make a scheme of all these models and look at their scores. Note that this may look like all models are equally large, but they certainly aren't. For example, the canopy theories and the salt eruption models are quite small. So how about we go for the largest model? The largest model by far is the no flood model, simply because it has many scientists working on it. We can also go for the model that has the highest score in being correct. In that case, we should go for Michael Oort's model. I think both ways of looking at it is wrong. Why just not pick out the truths out of all these models and combine that? So here's my final idea on what I think has happened. This is the Earth just before the flood happened. I chose to show partially the night side of the Earth. On day 1, large impacts happened on one side of the Earth. This caused the crust to rupture and initiated large lava flows. It started to rain massively on the colder continents. On day 40, the evaporation of water stopped, so the rain started to reduce and the continents got near their final position. At this point, 70% of the Earth was covered in molten lava that radiated its heat away into the universe. The other 30% was covered in water. On day 200, a lot of this lava had a solidified layer on top of it, and water flowed away from the continents. On day 300, almost all lava areas were closed off. And about 4,500 or 5,000 years later, we have the Earth as we know today. This is how I think the flood happened. Thank you for watching, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I hope to see you later.